The apostle who wrote the most beautiful words about love had just failed in the most beautiful city in the ancient world. Athens had not been violent. It had been worse than violent. It had been polite. The philosophers at the Areopagus had listened to Paul with the mild interest of people who collect new ideas the way others collect coins. Some of them even laughed not cruelly, just at the idea of resurrection, which struck them as quaint and provincial. Then they said, "Very interesting, thank you," and went back to their usual conversations. A handful believed. A handful out of the city that housed the Parthenon, that had produced Socrates and Aristotle and Plato, and Paul left. You do not leave Athens the way you entered it. You leave quietly, with the particular silence that follows a very long effort and a very small result. He walked south, more than 50 miles, down from the clean marble and philosophical distance of Athens into the noise and heat of Corinth. If you have ever walked out of a room where you gave everything you had and the room simply moved on, you already understand something about how that road felt. Corinth sat on a narrow strip of land between two seas, the Saronic Gulf to the east, the Gulf of Corinth to the west. Ships hauled their cargo overland across this isthmus rather than risk the long and dangerous voyage around the southern tip of Greece, which meant Corinth collected everything: wealth, merchants, sailors, soldiers, slaves, and the kind of restless vice that follows money wherever money flows. Strabo, the Greek geographer who knew this world intimately, wrote about Corinth's temple of Aphrodite on the hill, called the Acrocorinth, visible from the harbor, visible from the marketplace, visible from almost anywhere in the city. The ancient world had a verb, Corinthiaizesthai, which meant, roughly, to live the Corinthian way. It was not a compliment. It described a lifestyle so associated with one city that the entire Mediterranean world used that city's name to name it. 600,000 people, that is who Paul walked toward. He was tired. He was alone. He had left Silas and Timothy behind in Macedonia. And this is the word he will use later himself. Writing to the very church he is about to build, from nothing afraid. The Greek word is asthenia, weakness, vulnerability. Not failure exactly, more the honest human sensation of standing in front of something too large for you and knowing, in your bones, that you are the wrong size for the task. He arrived in Corinth with whatever he could carry. No crowd waiting, no prepared community, no letter of introduction to a wealthy patron. Just a city of 600,000 people, and a message about a crucified Jewish teacher whom Paul claimed had walked out of his own grave. And yet, something happened in those first days. A door opened in a crowded street. Two people looked up from their work, and everything that was about to happen in Corinth began right there, not in a synagogue, not in a public square, but in a workshop that smelled of leather and dust. We will come back to the night. God spoke to Paul in the dark, but not yet. Their names were Aquila and Priscilla. They were tent makers, the same trade Paul had learned as a young man in Tarsus. Probably at his father's workbench, probably before he ever imagined that skill would one day carry him across 3 continents. And they were Jewish, and they had just arrived in Corinth themselves, not by choice. The Emperor Claudius had issued an edict expelling all Jews from Rome. The historian Suetonius records it in his Life of Claudius and dates it to around 49 AD, the trigger. Suetonius writes, was constant disturbances in the Roman Jewish community over someone he calls Chrestus, a name most scholars believe refers to Christ. The arguments between followers of Jesus and traditional synagogue members having grown loud enough and disruptive enough to reach the emperor's desk. Claudius had no patience for social disorder. He expelled everyone, all of them, for the behavior of a faction within a community. Aquila was from Pontus, on the southern shore of the Black Sea, a long way from Rome, a long way from anything familiar now. He and Priscilla had built a life there, a trade, a community, a home, and then, because of a decision made in a palace they had never entered, they lost it overnight. They arrived in Corinth carrying what displaced people carry. Their skills, each other, and a faith that had already survived more than one upheaval. Paul moved in with them. He worked beside them during the week, cutting leather, stitching canvas, shaping the frames and coverings that shelters and markets and military camps all depended on. And on the Sabbath he preached in the synagogue. You can picture the scene. 3 people bent over their work in the early morning. The sounds of the city market building outside, and between them, a shared language, shared scriptures, shared history of being people who did not quite belong wherever they landed. This is how the mission began, not with a prepared crowd, not with momentum from a previous success, with calloused hands and a borrowed workspace, and 2 strangers who needed another worker and happened to share a faith. Here is what most people miss about this moment. The church at Corinth, the church that would receive 2 of the longest and most emotionally complex letters in the entire New Testament, was not founded on a stage or in a public square. It was founded at a workbench, between 3 people who were all, in different ways, starting over. Priscilla is worth pausing on. In the ancient world, it was standard to mention the husband first and the wife second. Protocol, hierarchy assumed. But in 4 of the 6 places this couple appears in the New Testament, Priscilla is listed before Aquila. Luke does it in Acts. Paul does it in his letters. Ancient readers would have noticed that inversion immediately. It suggests Priscilla was the more prominent teacher, the more recognized leader of the 2, unusual enough to note, but unremarkable enough in Paul's circle to need no explanation. She was not a footnote, she was a founder. And if you have ever done significant work without the official recognition attached to it, Priscilla is your evidence that God tracks what the title does not. Then Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, and something shifted. Acts tells us directly. When they came, Paul devoted himself exclusively to the word. He stopped working full days at the bench and committed entirely to preaching. This almost certainly reflects financial support arriving from the Philippian church. Paul no longer had to divide his time. Now he could preach every day in the synagogue, testifying that Jesus was the Messiah the scriptures had described. And for a while it worked. He argued the way he had been trained since childhood from the text outward, with precision, connecting the prophecies of suffering and redemption, tracing the lines that centuries of scripture had laid down before any Roman governor had signed any death warrant. Some of the synagogue congregation was persuaded. Some began to believe. But the atmosphere changed. The resistance grew, then hardened, then turned abusive. Something in Paul's preaching crossed a line the leadership was no longer willing to tolerate. And Paul made a decision. He stood up, he shook out his clothes, an ancient gesture like shaking dust from your sandals, like closing a book you will not reopen, a gesture of mourning and separation, legible to everyone in that room. And he said, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent of it. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." He walked out. He walked directly next door. Titius Justus was a Gentile who worshipped the God of Israel, a God-fearer. In the language of that world, and his house shared a wall with the synagogue. Paul moved the entire operation there. Every Sabbath, on one side of that wall, the synagogue continued. On the other side, Paul was preaching, close enough to hear each other, far enough apart that the divide was now physical, visible, final. The grief in this moment should not be rushed past. Paul was not performing a triumphant strategic pivot. He was a Jewish man who loved his people and his scriptures, being rejected by the community those scriptures had formed. Maybe you have been in a room where the people you had served the longest told you it was time to go, where the place that was supposed to be home became the place that turned you away. You do not forget that. He will write in his letter to Rome, almost certainly composed right here, in Corinth, that he could wish himself cut off from Christ if it meant Israel being saved. You do not write that sentence unless the pain of that separation is still bleeding. The mission kept moving. Paul kept preaching, because he had learned something that takes most people years to absorb. You can grieve and keep walking at the same time. And then, across that wall, something happened that nobody in that neighborhood expected. The ruler of the synagogue, Crispus, believed. He believed in Jesus as Messiah. He and his entire household were baptized, in full view of the community that had watched him lead worship every week. Remember that name. We will come back to what it cost him, and what it set in motion. I want you to feel the weight of what just happened. Paul has walked out of the synagogue. He is set up next door in a Gentile's house. And now the man who ran the synagogue, Crispus, has crossed the street and been baptized with his whole family. The thing Paul came to Corinth to do is starting to happen, not the way he planned. Not through the channels he expected. In the middle of a grief he has not finished processing, through a door he did not open. If you have ever been in a season where the right effort produced the wrong results, where you kept showing up, and the door stayed closed, what happens next in Paul's story is for you. Stay with me. What I am about to show you is the part that changes everything. That night, we do not know which night, only that it came somewhere within those 18 months Paul spent in Corinth. Paul had a vision. Not a dream, not a vague spiritual impression. Acts 18 uses the Greek phrase di horamatos, through a vision, a direct seeing. The Lord stood before Paul and said, "Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in this city." Read that last sentence again slowly. I have many people in this city. Not, I will give you many people if you prove yourself worthy. Not, I will give you results commensurate with your effort. Not even, keep working. It will eventually get better. God said present tense as a statement of existing fact. I have people there. They are already mine. You cannot see them yet, but they are there. We'll go find them. That is a stunning thing to say about Corinth, the city that had lent its name to an entire category of immorality. The city where the temple of Aphrodite commanded the skyline and the port city restlessness never quite settled. The city. Paul had walked into tired and alone and afraid, and God said, in that city, among those people, in the workshops and the markets and the streets you have been walking, I already have a people. Your job is to reach them, and Paul stayed 18 months. Look at his other stops for comparison. 3 weeks in the Thessalonica before being run out of town. Days in Berea, a single afternoon sermon in Athens. Corinth held him longer than anywhere else on his second missionary journey. The vision was the reason. God had told him, in direct terms, that the work here was not finished, and he was not to leave until it was. And in those 18 months, a church took shape. It was not a polished church. If you have read 1st or 2nd Corinthians, you already know this. Paul will spend the bulk of his correspondence with them addressing problems, divisions over teachers, confusion about spiritual gifts, arguments about food sacrificed to idols. A man in a relationship he should not be in, believers suing each other in public courts, people getting drunk at the Lord's Supper. These were not small problems. They were exactly the kind of problems that grow up when a community is assembled from people who come from very different worlds and are still learning what it means to live, as if those differences no longer define them. Paul will write to them, "Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth." He means it literally. The Corinthian church was not drawn from the educated class. It was slaves and freed people. Women whose names Paul would greet individually in his letters. Women who had no standing in the public square, but found standing in the ecclesia. The Greek word for church, meaning literally the called-out assembly. People summoned out of the surrounding world into a different way of being human together. These were God's people in Corinth, already his before Paul arrived, waiting for someone to come and find them. Here is what that means for you. The people God is calling you toward are not a project you are generating from nothing. They are already prepared. You are not creating their readiness. You are answering their waiting. Now, Crispus. When the ruler of the synagogue crossed the street and was baptized along with every member of his household, the effect on that community was immediate and irreversible. Crispus was not a private person. He organized Sabbath worship. He was responsible for the Torah scrolls. He was known by name and face across that neighborhood. His conversion happened in public, where everyone could see. Where there was no walking it back, Paul baptized him personally. That detail is in 1 Corinthians. Paul notes that he baptized Crispus and Gaius and the household of Stephanas, and almost no one else. Paul typically left baptism to others. He almost never performed it himself. He makes an exception for Crispus. The weight of that moment stayed with him years later when he sat down to write. Crispus's successor as synagogue ruler was a man named Sosthenes, and Sosthenes appears later in a scene that first looks like defeat. When Paul was eventually brought before the Roman proconsul Gallio, accused by the Jewish leadership of persuading people to worship God, contrary to the law, Sosthenes led the delegation that brought the charge. Gallio dismissed the case before Paul could even speak. Roman courts did not adjudicate internal Jewish theological disputes. When Gallio turned away, the crowd turned on Sosthenes and beat him in front of the tribunal. Gallio did not intervene, but here is the ending to that story. When Paul writes his first letter to the Corinthians, years later, the co-sender he names is our brother Sosthenes, the man who prosecuted Paul, now co-signing a letter with him. The story is larger than it first appears. We know the precise dates of all of this because of a stone in 1905. Archaeologists excavating at Delphi discovered an inscription, a letter from the Emperor Claudius that mentions Gallio by name as proconsul of Achaia. The Delphi inscription allowed scholars to anchor Paul's time in Corinth to approximately 50 to 52 AD with unusual precision. It is one of the most secure chronological anchors in the entire New Testament. History and scripture locked together by carved letters in rock, neither one dependent on the other, and both pointing to the same moment. Gallio was the brother of Seneca, the Stoic philosopher whose writings on death and courage are still being read today. He was described by contemporaries as charming and even-tempered. He dismissed Paul's case out of principle or boredom or both. And that dismissal, the indifference of a Roman administrator toward what seemed to him a minor religious argument, became the legal protection that kept the Corinthian mission alive long enough to become permanent. Pay attention to this. God does not only work through the faithful. Sometimes he works through the distracted. Sometimes the safety of an eternal mission depends on the momentary boredom of the powerful. And if you are someone who has been waiting for the right people to be in the right place, before you could move, you are watching God work through Gallio right now. If this is landing for you, if you are watching this and thinking about your own city, your own community, your own season of showing up without seeing results, what comes next is the reason I made this video. Years later, Paul sat down to write his first letter to the Corinthians. And he did something that once you see, it is hard to unsee. He told them he had been afraid. "When I came to you, brothers and sisters," he wrote, "I did not come with eloquence or superior wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling." Weakness, fear, much trembling. This is not false modesty. Paul was not a falsely modest person, he argued with Peter to his face about the gospel and wrote about the confrontation publicly. When Paul says he was afraid, he means it, and he is telling them this on purpose, because the Corinthians had started to prize eloquence and confidence and polish. They were ranking their teachers. Who speaks better? Who seems more powerful? Who has the more impressive background? Paul writes back, "When I stood in your city, my hands were shaking, and I preached anyway, not because I had conquered the fear first. Because the message was larger than the fear. The weakness was not a disqualification. It was the point." The Greek word asthenia means not just physical weakness, but the fragility of someone who does not know whether what they are doing is going to work. The vulnerability of standing in front of something too large and trusting that the size of the task is not the measure of your fitness for it. And here is the part that will either comfort you or unsettle you. Depending on where you are standing right now, you probably know this moment. You may be in it today, the moment where you are doing the thing you believe you are supposed to be doing, the calling, the mission, the work, the relationship, the community you are trying to build or hold together, and it is not working. The effort does not produce results. The prayers feel like they disappear before they arrive. The people you are trying to reach are not responding. The silence starts to feel less like patience and more like a verdict about you, specifically. That is precisely where Paul was standing when he walked into Corinth. He had come from Athens with almost nothing to show for it. He had entered a city with a word for immorality named after it. He was working with his hands by day to support himself, preaching in the evenings and on the Sabbath, and the synagogue was growing hostile, and he had no way of knowing whether any of this would result in a lasting community or in another experience like Athens. And he was, in his own words, afraid, and in the middle of that fear, not before it lifted, not after it passed, but inside it, while it was still very much present, God spoke. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, sitting in Tegel prison in Berlin in 1943, wrote a letter to his friend Eberhard Bethge about what he called faith, without the usual props. He was not writing in the abstract. He was a man whose letters were being read by guards before they left the building, who did not know whether he would survive the year, who was watching his country destroy itself in real time. He wrote about a faith that does not require external confirmation in order to continue. A faith that can operate when the silence is heavy, when the evidence available to your senses does not support what your soul believes, when the conditions are actively hostile to the thing you are trying to do. Bonhoeffer was executed in April 1945, 3 weeks before the camp that held him was liberated. Paul was not in a Nazi prison, but the category is the same. A man operating in the dark with a conviction he could not prove by the standards of the world around him. In a city that had given him no particular reason for hope, and God showed up in the night and said, "Do not stop. I have people here. Keep going." In the church Paul built in those 18 months, the church he stayed for, when everything in his pattern said it was time to move, that church outlasted the empire that tolerated it. The letters he wrote to those Corinthians are still being read today, in prison cells, in hospital waiting rooms, at kitchen tables at 3 in the morning when you cannot sleep, and the fear is louder than the faith, and you are not sure the next morning will look any different from this one. He came to that city in weakness. He stayed in faith, and the work of a frightened, exhausted apostle in a borrowed workshop became the foundation of something that has not stopped standing. The same God who spoke in the dark in Corinth speaks in the dark wherever you are, not when everything is in order, now in the hard season, in the workshop, in the place where the conditions are wrong and the opposition is real and the fear has not gone away. He has people there. He is asking whether you will go find them. 3 things this story is saying to you directly. 1. God does not send his people to the cities that are ready for them. He sends them to the cities that need them. Corinth was not a welcoming mission field. It was complicated and hostile and notorious. And God said, "I already have people there. Your obedience is not the precondition for what I do. It is the instrument I use to reach them. You do not create the harvest, you show up for it." 2. Fear is not the opposite of faith. Paul was afraid in Corinth. He wrote about it in plain language to the very people he built the church with. He did not hide it, did not resolve it before preaching. Paul did not wait until the trembling stopped. The shaking hands did not disqualify him from the work. Neither do yours. 3. Sit with this one. The people who built the church at Corinth were not the gifted or the powerful or the perfectly prepared. They were a couple expelled from their home, a frightened apostle fresh from his worst reception, a synagogue ruler who crossed the street in full view of everyone who knew him, and a God who said quietly in the dark, "I have people here, go find them," that is, who built something that lasted 2,000 years. There are people in your city too, already his, waiting. The same God who spoke to Paul in the night speaks to you in yours. He is not waiting for your fear to disappear first. He is asking whether you will take the next step while it is still there. Which moment in this story hit you hardest, Paul's fear, Crispus crossing the street, or the voice in the dark? Tell me in the comments. I want to know.